When I asked about the date of my son's wedding, I expected to hear something joyful, maybe a plan to circle on my calendar, a dress to take from the back of my closet, a moment to finally feel like the years of raising him had come full circle. But instead, the message I received was short and sharp, telling me it had already happened yesterday and that it was only for special people. The words looked polite on the screen, but they cut straight through me because the meaning was obvious. I was not considered one of those people. I forced myself to type congratulations with a heart emoji I didn't feel. Then I set the phone down on the lace tablecloth my mother had given me and stared at the quiet kitchen, wondering when love had been replaced with exclusion and how I had suddenly been left on the outside of my own son's most important day. If you've ever felt that kind of sting, you know it lingers. And if moments like this resonate with you, a kind comment, or even a simple like, truly helps me keep sharing these stories. Your support makes a real difference. My name is Lauren Bennett. I'm 35 years old, and I've lived my whole life in the Midwest where practicality is second nature, and emotions are usually hidden under chores and casseroles. I raised my son Ethan mostly on my own, working long hours as a bookkeeper for local businesses, balancing columns late into the night while he slept, and I learned to stretch every dollar and to turn disappointment into quiet resilience. I own a small duplex I rent out because I've always believed a woman needs something steady she can stand on, and though people often see me as reserved, I've come to understand that silence is not weakness. It is simply choosing carefully when to spend your voice. That day, sitting alone with the words, "special people," echoing in my head, I felt the tears come anyway, slipping down my cheeks as I tried to convince myself I was being too sensitive, even though deep down I knew I wasn't. The next morning, I baked lemon bars, because in my family, baking has always been the answer when your heart doesn't know what to do, and I carried a neat box of them across town to my son's apartment, hoping that something sweet might open a door that had just been closed on me. Olivia opened it with a polished smile that looked like it belonged in a photograph, but not in real life, her perfect hair framing a face that offered no warmth, and she accepted the box with a nod that made me feel less like a mother and more like a delivery driver. I stood there waiting for Ethan to appear, but he never did. And Olivia excused herself with a line about being busy with married life before shutting the door gently, not angry, just final. I drove home in silence, letting the miles pass under the tires while my chest ached in ways no song on the radio could ease, and I knew I had just been placed on the outside of something I should have been at the heart of. Back home, I buried the ache in chores, vacuuming the living room as though it owed me money and folding laundry with the focus of someone determined not to fall apart. But every task reminded me of the years I had spent carrying Ethan's life in both hands, the sacrifices I had made so he could stand tall, and how quickly all of it had been rewritten. I kept telling myself not to let it crush me, because wounds can harden into strength when you let them, and quiet anger can be sharper than loud rage when the moment finally comes to use it. And just as I was beginning to think I might be overreacting, my phone buzzed again a week later, and Olivia's voice rang out demanding to know if I had already transferred the rent because it was overdue, as though paying their bills was simply my job. And in that moment, something in me shifted. The sorrow began to burn away, leaving behind a steady coal of determination, the kind that waits patiently but never goes out. A week after the sting of being told that I wasn't one of the special people at my own son's wedding, my phone buzzed with a call that made my stomach twist before I even answered. And on the other end was Olivia's voice, brisk and polished like a customer service rep reading from a script, asking not whether I could help with rent, but whether I had already paid it, as if it were a matter of routine, my assigned duty. The entitlement in her tone caught me off guard more than the request itself, because in the past I had quietly helped Ethan through a tough month or two, convincing myself that it was temporary, that once he found his footing, I would no longer need to step in, but this was different. There was no pretense of gratitude, no recognition of sacrifice, just a demand delivered with the kind of clipped confidence that comes when someone believes they have already won. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the sunlight crawling across the lace cloth, hearing her voice roll over me, and realizing in that moment that something inside me had shifted. It wasn't the request for money that hurt the most, it was the assumption that I owed it, that my place in their life had been reduced from mother to financial safety net, and when kindness turns into obligation, respect has already been erased. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself, because I have lived long enough to know that the person who talks the most often reveals the most, and I decided to let her speak while I stored every word in the quiet ledger of my mind. My response was short and calm, telling her I would look into it, and then I ended the call with a voice so steady it surprised even me. Once the line was silent, I didn't reach for my checkbook or for my purse. Instead, I opened my laptop and began searching for the only thing that never lies: paper trails. Years of bookkeeping had trained me to see what others miss, and within minutes I found gaps that were louder than any raised voice. There was no marriage license filed under their names in the county, no legal documents, no record of a ceremony beyond the glossy photos Olivia had plastered online. Photos that were taken on staircases and gardens I recognized as public spaces that required no payment and no booking. Meanwhile, the gift registry told another story, showing generous contributions from friends and extended family that disappeared almost instantly into cash withdrawals. It was like watching numbers tell a story Olivia had tried so hard to hide, a story not of vows and love, but of performance and profit, a carefully staged illusion with no foundation underneath. And as I stared at the screen, I remembered something that almost made me laugh out loud, though the laugh was dry and humorless. The apartment Ethan and Olivia lived in was part of a small duplex I had bought years ago, tucked neatly under an LLC with my maiden name. It had always been my quiet safety net, the investment I told myself would keep me secure no matter what storms life threw at me. And now here was Olivia, speaking to me like I was some outsider with no authority, when the truth was that she lived under my roof by a lease I had written and signed. That thought lit a spark of satisfaction inside me, not because I wanted revenge just yet, but because I realized I wasn't powerless. I wasn't excluded entirely from their world, not in the way Olivia wanted me to believe. The lease was explicit about due dates, about rules, about subletting. And suddenly, I remembered the neighbor who had mentioned the sound of luggage wheels bumping up the stairs at odd hours, different visitors every weekend, whispers of short-term stays in that second bedroom. The irony was almost too much. Here she was demanding rent money from me when she was the one violating the very agreement that gave her the right to live there. That night, I spread papers across my dining table as if I were laying out pieces of armor, each document a shield against the disrespect that had been piling up like dust. There was the lease agreement with its clear clause against subletting, the county search results that confirmed no marriage license existed, and screenshots of transactions showing gift money turning into cash withdrawals with no matching expenses. For years, I had thought the only way to preserve peace was to keep giving, to hand over money, time, patience, and dignity in exchange for scraps of appreciation. But as I sat surrounded by those pages, I realized that giving had not brought peace. It had only trained others to expect more. Each document I placed into a neat folder felt like a weight sliding off my shoulders, replaced by something steadier: clarity. It wasn't rage that filled me, nor bitterness, but the calm certainty that I no longer had to play the part of the wallet disguised as a mother. I promised myself then that I would not shout or plead, because shouting fades and pleading is forgotten. But records endure, and rules are harder to ignore. I went to bed with that folder resting on the chair beside me, almost like a reminder that I was no longer powerless, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without waking to replay what had been said and unsaid. In the morning, I brewed strong coffee, packed the folder neatly into my bag, and added a small plate of oatmeal cookies, because no matter how firm my boundaries, I was still me, still someone who believes sweetness softens even the hardest truths. I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving, cardigan straight, hair pulled back, eyes steady, and I thought about how often people confuse quiet women with weak women. They don't realize that quiet women keep receipts, and sometimes receipts are sharper than knives. That day, I knew with complete certainty that Olivia thought she had me cornered, that she believed her demands were unshakable. But I had already started building something far stronger than her words. A plan written in paper and patience, waiting for the right moment to speak louder than I ever could. In the days after Olivia's call, I carried on with my routines, making dinners for one, balancing accounts for the local bakery, and jogging around the block in the chilly morning air. But underneath those ordinary motions, something steady was growing, a kind of quiet flame that refused to go out. I kept looking at the papers I had collected and the notes I had written in the margins, and the more I read them, the clearer it became that Olivia's confidence was not built on solid ground but on sand, dressed up with filters and borrowed gloss. She had thrown the words, "special people," like a dart meant to pierce me. But now I understood that it was nothing more than theater, a curtain meant to hide that there was no real wedding, no legal bond, and no foundation for the demands she was pressing onto me. That realization changed everything, because once you see the cracks in someone's mask, it becomes impossible to take their performance seriously. One evening, I sat with my folder spread across the dining table again, the lemony scent of a half-finished pound cake still in the air, and I noticed something I had missed before. The rental agreement, signed in neat ink by Ethan and co-signed by me as the landlord, required any legal spouse to be added within 30 days, with documentation provided. It was a clause I had written myself years ago after too many headaches with tenants bringing in partners who caused nothing but trouble. And now that little clause stood out like a small but powerful weapon sitting quietly in my hands. I didn't need to confront Olivia with accusations or emotional appeals. I didn't need to demand respect with words. I could simply require what the lease required, and the absence of proof would speak louder than anything I might try to argue. It was such a small line in a sea of paragraphs, but in that moment, it felt like a life raft because I finally had a way to turn her own arrogance into her undoing without raising my voice once. The thought gave me energy I hadn't felt in weeks. Instead of feeling like an outsider, I began to see myself as someone who still held keys, both literally and figuratively, to the world Olivia thought she controlled. I could call for a compliance review, request documentation, and demand signatures, all with the calm authority of someone following procedure rather than emotion. Olivia might be able to craft social media posts with perfect lighting and captions that dripped with superiority, but she couldn't Photoshop her way through county records or lease agreements. What if, I thought to myself, instead of shrinking from the disrespect, I leaned into the structures I had already built? What if, instead of being the mother who cries in silence, I became the landlord who enforces her own rules? The idea made me smile in a way I hadn't in weeks, a small curl of satisfaction that tasted better than any dessert I could bake. That night I slept deeply, and when I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was brew strong coffee and start drafting a letter requesting updated documentation for the lease, including proof of legal marriage if Olivia wanted to be listed as a spouse. I didn't phrase it as a challenge, only as routine procedure, the kind of bland official language that looks harmless on paper but carries the weight of obligation underneath. For the first time since being told I wasn't a special person, I didn't feel excluded. I felt anchored, steady, and strangely in control. The injustice that had stung so badly was now shifting into an opportunity, a way to quietly hold Olivia accountable, not with anger, but with facts. And as I folded that letter and slipped it into the folder with the rest of my documents, I realized that the spark of hope was no longer just a flicker. It was the beginning of a plan. Once the spark of hope lit inside me, I knew I couldn't let it die out, and so I began shaping it into something sharper, something that could not only protect me, but also expose the truth that Olivia had tried so hard to hide. I reminded myself that revenge in my hands would never look like screaming matches or slammed doors. It would look like paperwork stacked neatly in a folder, like quiet questions that demanded answers, like calm reminders of rules that no amount of arrogance could erase. I had spent my life managing numbers, contracts, and details that other people ignored. And now those very skills that had once felt so ordinary were turning into my armor. I decided the best way to confront Olivia was not by confronting her at all, but by creating a situation where her own lies would collapse under their own weight. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the lease itself would be my stage, and I only had to invite her to perform on it. I drafted a polite notice and scheduled what I called a lease update meeting at my small property office, a modest room above a hardware store where the walls smelled faintly of dust and fresh paint, a place so unremarkable that it gave me the advantage. I framed the meeting as routine, a necessary step to keep files current, and I included a line requesting the legal marriage certificate so that Olivia could be added as a spouse on the lease. I knew she would either have to produce something real, which I had already discovered did not exist, or bring a forgery that would crumble under scrutiny. To ensure everything stayed official, I arranged for a notary to be present, not because I expected signatures that day, but because the presence of a witness has a way of turning bold liars into hesitant storytellers. I slipped the notice into an envelope with steady hands, feeling calmer than I had in weeks, because this wasn't about begging for respect anymore. It was about taking it back without saying a single angry word. In the days leading up to the meeting, Olivia continued her performance on social media, posting curated photos of dinners and outings, the kind of glossy snapshots designed to make her life look polished. But even through the filters, I noticed cracks. The captions were full of little jabs about starting fresh and finally living life the right way. Words meant for an audience that didn't include me, but that revealed more than she realized. Ethan, on the other hand, grew quieter, his presence fading from the photos, his voice missing from my phone. And though it hurt to see my son drifting further away, it also confirmed what I suspected. He wasn't steering the ship anymore. He was just holding on while Olivia charted the course. I told myself to stay patient, to let her believe she had full control, because there is nothing more dangerous to someone like her than believing no one is watching, when in truth, every step is being recorded in neat handwriting on the margins of my notes. The night before the meeting, I baked oatmeal cookies, not because I thought Olivia deserved them, but because I knew I would need them. Food softens the edges of hard conversations, and women my age understand that sometimes a plate of cookies on the table can lower defenses faster than any clever speech. I packed them carefully alongside my folder of documents and my notary's card, and as I zipped up my bag, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, hair pulled back, cardigan neat, eyes steady, and I thought about how many times in my life I had been underestimated because I chose silence over noise. Olivia thought she was playing chess with a woman who only knew checkers, but she didn't understand that I had been studying every move she made, waiting for the right moment to place my own piece on the board. Tomorrow, the first domino would fall, and she wouldn't even realize it until it was too late. The morning of the meeting arrived gray and damp, the kind of weather that usually makes you want to stay under blankets. But I felt sharper than I had in months, almost as if the clouds themselves were clearing a path for me. I set the oatmeal cookies on the table in my small property office, arranged the lease papers neatly into 3 stacks, and placed a pen beside the notary's ledger with the calm precision of someone preparing for a quiet performance. When Olivia walked in, she was dressed as if the world were a runway, heels clicking on the old wooden floor, her hair perfectly smooth, her lips painted the shade of someone who wants to leave a mark, and behind her trailed Ethan, his eyes downcast, his shoulders rounded in a way that made me ache. Olivia gave me that polished smile again, the one that had once made me feel small, but this time I saw the cracks underneath it, and instead of shrinking, I leaned back in my chair and let silence do the work until she finally asked if we could make this quick because they had other plans. I explained calmly that this was a routine lease update, nothing unusual, just standard procedure whenever a tenant's marital status changed, and I slid the form across the table with the line requesting a marriage certificate highlighted in yellow. Olivia's smile faltered just slightly, the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, before she reached into her oversized handbag and pulled out a decorative certificate printed on thick paper, the kind you could order online with a few clicks. She placed it on the table as though it were proof carved in stone, but the notary glanced at it once and raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by the lack of seal or official signature. I didn't need to say a word. The paper was already shouting for me. I folded my hands and waited, watching Olivia's confidence waver in the silence. And when Ethan finally looked up at me, his eyes met mine for the first time in weeks. And in that glance, I could see the question forming in his mind. What if none of this was real? Before Olivia could gather her composure, I laid out the second stack of papers, the screenshots of short-term rental listings tied to their apartment address, the evidence of suitcases rolling in and out, the clear violation of the lease agreement they had both signed. I spoke softly, not with anger, but with the steady voice of someone who has nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear, explaining that subletting was a breach of contract and that restitution would be required. Olivia's polished exterior cracked further, her hands tightening around the strap of her bag, while Ethan's face paled as if every drop of color had been drained out of him. I could almost hear the weight of realization settling on him, that the woman he thought had built a life with him had instead built a facade with borrowed money and other people's generosity. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the scratch of the notary's pen, noting the date and time. And for the first time since all this began, I felt the ground shift back beneath my feet. The final blow came when I gently pulled out the transaction records, a neat stack showing every gift transfer from friends and relatives funneled into cash withdrawals with no matching wedding expenses. I didn't accuse, I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed the papers down and said that transparency was required before the lease could be renewed. Olivia's face, once so carefully arranged, collapsed into a mixture of anger and panic, her words stumbling as she tried to explain away the gaps. But the cousins who had sent the largest amounts were sitting quietly in the back of the room, having accepted my invitation to witness the meeting, and when they saw their names on the records, their whispers of betrayal cut through Olivia's excuses like knives. Ethan sank into his chair, his head in his hands, and I sat there steady as a rock, letting the document speak every truth I no longer needed to voice. In that moment, the performance was over. The mask had fallen, and Olivia, who had once spoken to me as though I were nothing, found herself cornered by her own lies, her own arrogance, and the undeniable weight of paper. The air in the small office seemed to thicken after the last document hit the table, and for a moment no one spoke, as if even the notary's pen had grown tired of recording the obvious. Olivia shifted in her chair, her eyes darting between me, the cousins, and Ethan, searching for an ally and finding none, her polished mask slipping further with each passing second. For weeks she had played the part of the untouchable one, the woman who had the power to exclude me. but now the silence itself had turned against her, and every second it stretched was a reminder that the authority in the room no longer belonged to her. I felt it then. The slow but undeniable turning of the tide, the kind of reversal you can almost hear, like water pulling back before a wave crashes. The woman who had once told me I wasn't a special person now looked like a guest in her own performance, out of lines, out of script, and out of control. Ethan finally lifted his head from his hands, and when he looked at me, there was no anger, no defiance, only the hollow confusion of someone realizing they had been living in a house built on sand. He asked Olivia quietly where the money had gone, his voice shaking, and the way she snapped back at him without an answer told me everything. The cousins leaned forward, their patience unraveling, their eyes sharp with betrayal, and Olivia, who once strutted with unshakable confidence, shrank visibly under the weight of their questions. It wasn't me she had to answer anymore. It was everyone else, and there is nothing lonelier than watching the crowd you relied on turn their gaze against you. I sat back, calm and steady, because I knew I didn't need to win this argument. She was losing it all by herself. For the first time in weeks, I felt my chest expand with something that wasn't sorrow or anger, but relief, a deep, quiet relief that comes from watching justice right itself in real time. I thought back to that message about special people, how it had cut me so deeply, and now I realize the irony of it all. I was the one holding the documents, the lease, the rules, the evidence, while Olivia was left scrambling for excuses, her words thin as smoke. The contrast was almost too perfect. The woman who thought she had banished me to the margins now sat cornered in the center of the room, exposed in front of my son, our family, and a notary who would seal the record with ink that would outlast every excuse she could conjure. What once felt like humiliation had transformed into vindication, and it was not loud or dramatic. It was simple and undeniable, and that made it all the more powerful. Olivia's final attempt at control was to stand and gather her bag, her voice rising as she declared the meeting a waste of her time. But the cousin stopped her with calm, firm words, demanding restitution for the gifts they had sent, their disappointment heavier than any anger. Ethan didn't defend her, didn't move to shield her. He just sat there staring at the papers as though seeing his life written in numbers for the first time. And me? I reached for the plate of cookies I had brought, sliding them toward the center of the table with a small smile, because women like me know that sometimes the most powerful statement is not a threat, but the steady act of staying seated when others storm out. I no longer felt like an outsider or a forgotten mother. I felt like a woman who had stood her ground, and in that quiet reversal, I had already won. When Olivia stormed out of the office that day, heels snapping against the old wood like angry punctuation marks, I felt no need to follow her, because the damage had already been done, and the beauty of it was that I hadn't needed to raise my voice or lose my dignity to get there. Ethan stayed behind, pale and shaken, staring at the evidence scattered across the table as though he were seeing his life under a microscope for the very first time. The cousins quietly gathered their copies of the documents, their disappointment heavy, but their resolve firm, and I knew Olivia would soon face demands she couldn't wiggle out of with charm or excuses. The notary closed her ledger with a neat snap, leaving a permanent record that would outlast the memory of the heated voices. And as the room emptied, I sat there for a moment longer, breathing in the rare calm that comes when truth finally rises above lies. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects spread quickly, faster than I could have imagined, and each one seemed to peel away another layer of Olivia's carefully curated facade. The cousins filed small claims to recover the money they had given, armed with the transaction printouts I had shared, and soon word reached extended family who had also contributed. The registry that had once been a showcase of generosity was now evidence of betrayal, and Olivia's reputation, which she had polished so relentlessly online, began to crumble in the places that mattered most, among people who knew her name and her habits. Ethan moved back into my garage apartment, not with shame, but with a kind of relief, as if he were finally stepping off a stage he had never wanted to be on. And though I felt both sadness and anger at what he had endured, I also felt a quiet pride that he had chosen to come back to steadiness rather than stay tied to deception. Olivia's hold on Ethan unraveled with surprising speed once the truth had been dragged into daylight. The lease addendum she had refused to sign became her undoing, because without documentation, she had no standing, and when her short-term rental activity was exposed, her right to remain in the apartment evaporated. The neighbors who had once smiled politely at her polished presence now whispered behind her back, and her glossy photos disappeared from social media one by one, replaced with silence. I didn't need to confront her further. I didn't need to gloat or announce my victory, because life itself was handing her the lessons she had so carelessly invited. Watching her retreat felt almost surreal, like watching a tower of cards collapse, not because someone knocked it down, but because it was never built to last. Through it all, I stayed steady, keeping my routines intact, brewing coffee in the mornings, working my bookkeeping jobs, baking on Sundays, and making sure Ethan understood that he still had a home with me, even if trust would take time to rebuild. I didn't lecture him, because he was already carrying enough shame. I simply let him sit at the kitchen table while I folded laundry or stirred soup, and slowly he began to open up about the pressure, the manipulation, the ways Olivia had convinced him that shutting me out was proof of loyalty. Hearing it hurt, but it also confirmed what I already knew, that he had been pulled into her orbit, not because he was weak, but because he was kind, and kindness in the wrong hands can be twisted into a weapon. And so, as Olivia's world shrank around her, mine began to feel whole again, not because I had sought revenge in anger, but because I had chosen to stand quietly in the truth, letting it do the work that rage never could. I thought the storm had already passed when Olivia left the apartment and her glossy world began to unravel. But sometimes, life has a way of saving the heaviest stone for last. The one truth that lands so suddenly, it changes everything you thought you knew. It started with an email from the county clerk's office, routine and almost boring at first glance, simply confirming that no marriage license had been filed under Ethan's name. But then, in the notes section, a single line caught my eye. Olivia's name had appeared on a previous license, filed just 2 years earlier with another man, a union that had been annulled on grounds of fraud. My hands trembled as I read it, not from surprise exactly, but from the cold clarity of seeing the mask ripped away entirely, the performance replaced with the record of who she truly was. She hadn't simply deceived us in the moment, she had a history of deception, a pattern of using vows like poker chips, and suddenly all her confidence, all her polished smiles, looked like the recycled moves of someone who had played the same game before. I sat with that email for a long time, the screen glowing in the dim kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound around me, and I thought about how many times Olivia had tried to make me feel small, how many times she had spoken to me as though I were irrelevant, when in truth she was the one living in shadows, carrying a history she could never admit aloud. The fraud annulment explained so much. Her obsession with money, her fixation on image, her cold insistence that respect was owed to her rather than earned. It was no accident, no misunderstanding. It was a carefully rehearsed cycle, and this time she had chosen Ethan as her mark. The realization cut deep, but it also gave me a strange sense of peace, because I finally understood that her cruelty toward me had never really been personal. It was just part of her pattern, and seeing it for what it was lifted a weight from my chest I hadn't even known I was carrying. I debated whether to share the discovery, whether to let the past speak for itself, or to place it into Ethan's hands so he could finally see every thread of the tapestry she had woven around him. In the end, I decided he deserved the truth. Not because I wanted to wound him further, but because truth is the only medicine strong enough to heal betrayal. When I showed him the email, he stared at it in silence for a long time, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the screen as though if he blinked it might disappear. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and let out a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh, the kind of sound that comes when pain and relief collide, and he whispered that he should have known, that the signs had been there, that he had ignored too many red flags because he wanted so badly to believe in love. I put my hand over his and told him that mistakes don't define a person, but refusing to learn from them does. And in that moment, I saw the first flicker of resolve return to my son's face. Word of Olivia's past spread quickly once the cousins, armed with their claims and my documents, shared what they had learned. And soon the circle of people who once admired her carefully curated life began to see her for who she really was. Friends distanced themselves, relatives demanded answers, and the admiration she had craved so desperately curdled into suspicion and disdain. Olivia, who once strutted through rooms certain of her superiority, was now reduced to whispers in hallways and side glances in grocery stores, her reputation crumbling not because I destroyed it, but because the truth had finally stepped into the light. And as for me, I felt no glee in her downfall, only a steady sense of balance returning, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice doesn't need to be screamed from rooftops. Sometimes it only needs to be revealed. Once the truth about Olivia's past surfaced, it would have been easy to let it rest there, to stand back and allow the damage to spread naturally. But I knew from experience that people like her often find ways to twist even the worst exposure into another performance. She might have been cornered, but cornered people can be dangerous, and I wanted to make sure there was no room left for reinvention, no shadow where she could hide her manipulations. That was when I began to think about the power of public accountability, how deception thrives in whispers and secrets, but collapses when brought into daylight. I realized that if I staged one more moment, carefully constructed but rooted in nothing but truth, Olivia's own arrogance would do the rest of the work for me. The idea wasn't revenge in the loud, messy sense, but more like setting a mirror in front of her, forcing her to look at what she had done, not just to Ethan and me, but to everyone she had used along the way. I reached out to the cousins who had filed claims, inviting them to meet once more at my office, not as enemies, but as witnesses, and I explained that it was important for all of us to hear Olivia's answers directly, rather than piecing them together through rumors. They agreed quickly, their frustration still fresh, their desire for closure stronger than any lingering hurt. I also called the community liaison for the building, the same woman who had handled tenant disputes before with sharp eyes and a firm sense of fairness, and I asked if she could sit in as a neutral observer. She agreed, perhaps sensing more than I told her, and I felt reassured knowing her presence would give the meeting a weight Olivia couldn't dismiss as personal. Then I prepared invitations not with anger, but with calm politeness, slipping them into envelopes that simply asked for attendance at a lease compliance review. It was all so ordinary on the surface, but beneath that ordinary language lay the stage for a reckoning Olivia would not see coming. In the days leading up to it, I noticed how Olivia tried to patch the holes in her image. She posted fewer photos but added captions about moving forward and learning lessons, as if she were the one offering wisdom rather than scrambling to salvage her reputation. Ethan stayed quiet, his phone often face down on the table, and when I asked how he felt about seeing her again, he admitted that part of him dreaded it, while another part longed for final clarity, the kind that only comes when illusions are shattered face to face. I told him that facing the truth would hurt, but it was better than living with questions that eat away at your sleep, And he nodded in that weary way grown children do when they finally see their parents were right all along. Watching him wrestle with those emotions was painful, but it also reminded me why I was doing this. Not to punish Olivia for myself, but to free my son from the last chains of her influence. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived early and laid everything out with the same care I would give to setting a Sunday dinner table, each stack of papers neatly aligned, each chair positioned so that no one could avoid eye contact. I placed a small plate of brownies in the center because even in the heaviest moments, sweetness helps people stay grounded, and I wanted no one to mistake my firmness for cruelty. When Olivia finally walked in, dressed sharply but with less shine than before, I could see the tension in the set of her jaw, the slight tightness around her eyes, and for the first time she looked less like a queen entering her court and more like a defendant walking into a hearing she couldn't charm her way out of. Ethan sat on one side of the table, the cousins on the other, the liaison just behind me, and I felt the quiet weight of what was about to unfold settle over the room like a curtain waiting to rise. The stage was set, the witnesses gathered, and Olivia, still unaware, was about to walk straight into her own undoing. The room was quiet when I began, not the silence of comfort, but the charged silence of people waiting for something to happen, and I used that wait to steady my voice. I explained calmly that the purpose of this meeting was simple, a compliance review to clarify the lease and confirm records, nothing more and nothing less, and I slid the first set of documents across the table toward Olivia with the same deliberate care I would use in handing a knife by its handle. Her eyes flicked over the highlighted lines about spousal documentation, and when she failed to produce anything official beyond the decorative paper she had shown before, the community liaison cleared her throat softly, a sound small in volume but enormous in meaning. The cousins leaned forward, their gazes sharp, and I sat back without a word, because sometimes silence is the loudest accusation of all. Olivia attempted to regain control, insisting that the lack of a seal was just an oversight, that the real papers were being processed. But before she could weave the lie further, I placed the second stack of evidence in front of her. The screenshots of short-term rentals linked to her address, the photographs of guests hauling luggage up the stairs, the clear breach of the lease agreement. For weeks she had strutted as though rules were for everyone but her, but now, faced with undeniable proof, her confidence faltered. She tried to laugh it off, a brittle sound that didn't convince anyone, but the community liaison's stern face left no room for excuses. And the cousins whispered to each other in disbelief, shaking their heads. Ethan sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the papers, as though each page were another nail sealing the coffin of the life he thought he had built with her. When I finally laid down the transaction records, listing every gift transferred into cash and never spent on any real ceremony, the shift in the room was immediate, like the sharp click of a lock turning. The cousins recognized their names, their money, their betrayal laid bare in black and white, and the air filled with a mix of outrage and sorrow that no amount of Olivia's polished words could dilute. She reached for explanations, grasping at stories about unexpected expenses and private decisions, but each word fell flatter than the last, drowned out by the visible disappointment of the people she had once charmed. Ethan lifted his head at last, his voice breaking as he asked her directly where the money had gone, and when she snapped at him in frustration instead of answering, the sound echoed through the room like the crack of a whip, leaving everyone staring at her in stunned silence. The meeting didn't end with shouting or theatrics. It ended with signatures. The liaison recorded the violations, the cousins outlined their restitution demands, and Olivia, cornered and stripped of allies, was forced to sign the lease addendum, not as a spouse but as a roommate, her name listed with none of the status she had claimed for herself. The notary's pen scratched steadily across the paper, sealing what little control she thought she still had into something smaller, something humiliating. and I watched as her hand trembled with every stroke of ink. When it was done, she gathered her things and left without looking at anyone, her exit no longer a storm, but a retreat. I sat quietly at the table, offering the plate of brownies to the others, and for the first time since that first cruel message about special people, I felt the scales finally balance, the truth clicking into place in front of everyone who mattered. In the days after the meeting, the fallout unfolded quickly, not with the drama Olivia thrived on, but with the slow, steady weight of accountability pressing down from all sides. The cousins wasted no time filing formal claims, attaching the very documents she had signed in front of the notary, and soon she was facing more than just angry relatives. She was staring at legal obligations that could no longer be avoided. The community liaison filed her own report with the housing board, citing the subletting violations and the falsified documents, and that report alone was enough to put Olivia on a watch list that would make it difficult for her to rent again under her own name. For someone who built her world on appearances and borrowed credibility, losing the basic ability to secure a place to live was more than punishment. It was the unraveling of the carefully curated life she had tried to sell to everyone around her. Ethan, for his part, finally admitted how long he had felt trapped, how Olivia's charm had begun as flattery, but had quickly turned into control, isolating him from me, from his cousins, even from his own friends. He spoke quietly about the way she had monitored his phone, the way she had convinced him that leaning on me was weakness, and how every financial demand had been framed as proof of his loyalty. Hearing it made my heart ache, but it also made me realize that what looked from the outside like carelessness on his part had actually been manipulation he wasn't equipped to see through. Once the truth had been laid bare, he seemed lighter, as though the weight of constant performance had finally been lifted off his shoulders. He moved into the small garage apartment behind my house, and though we didn't speak much in the first week, his simple presence there, the sound of his footsteps, the sight of his jacket on a chair, felt like a piece of my world was settling back into place. Olivia tried briefly to salvage her image. She posted vague messages online about betrayal and resilience, the kind of cryptic lines meant to invite sympathy, but they fell flat because too many people already knew the truth. One by one, her allies fell away. Friends who once admired her polish stopped returning calls. Family members who once defended her began to ask pointed questions, and the silence around her grew louder than any rumor could. When she failed to make the first restitution payment to the cousins, the court issued a judgment that not only demanded repayment, but added fees, leaving her financially cornered in a way that stripped her of the power she had wielded so confidently. Watching from the sidelines, I felt no glee, only the deep satisfaction of balance returning, the knowledge that she had been brought low not by cruelty, but by the very lies she had spun too tightly to escape. For me, the greatest consequence was not Olivia's downfall, but Ethan's return to himself. I began to see glimpses of the boy I had raised, the kindness that had been twisted into weakness, slowly regaining its strength, the way he volunteered to mow the lawn without being asked, the way he sat at the kitchen table with me one evening and ate my lasagna as if it were the first real meal he'd had in months. He apologized, not in grand speeches, but in small moments, in the way he listened when I spoke, in the way he lingered just a little longer at home before heading out to work. I told him he didn't owe me guilt, only growth, and I meant it. Olivia had wanted me erased, but instead I had regained not only my son's presence, but his trust, and that was worth more than any dramatic revenge could have ever delivered. When the dust finally settled, life did not return to the way it was before, but it did settle into something quieter, something sturdier, and for me, that was enough. Ethan stayed in the small garage apartment, paying his rent on time and slowly piecing his life back together, without the constant shadow of Olivia hovering over him. I gave him space, but also offered little gestures of steadiness, a plate of food left at his door, a warm lamp left on when I knew he would come home late, and over time those gestures built a new rhythm between us, less like mother and child and more like two adults who had chosen to trust each other again. I knew it would take time to mend everything that had been frayed, but I also knew time was something we had, and this time I would not let fear or silence keep me from taking my place in his life. Olivia, on the other hand, faded into the kind of background where people whisper but no longer look her way with admiration. She missed her restitution payments, and the cousins pursued her in court until every penny was legally bound to be returned, her name etched into records she could not erase. Her online persona, once a carousel of polished smiles and curated captions, dissolved into silence. And when she tried to rebuild it in smaller circles, the past followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. For someone who had once thrived on being the center of attention, being ignored turned out to be the harshest punishment of all. And I found it fitting, not because I wished her endless suffering, but because the truth had finally stripped her of the very thing she valued most, the illusion of control. For myself, I discovered that peace does not always come from grand victories or dramatic confrontations, but from the quiet act of standing your ground, of refusing to be erased by those who think they can define your worth. I had been told I wasn't a special person, yet by the end of it all, it was my steadiness, my patience, and my refusal to buy my way into respect that had proven otherwise. I learned that silence can be sharper than anger, and that sometimes the best revenge is not loud or messy, but calm, methodical, and public enough that the truth speaks for itself. Most of all, I learned that you cannot stop people from trying to misuse your kindness, but you can decide not to fund your own disrespect, and once you make that decision, the balance shifts forever in your favor. And so the story closed not with fireworks, but with a steady flame, the kind that warms a home long after the storm has passed. I found myself laughing again, not bitterly, but freely, and I returned to my routines with a lighter heart, knowing I had faced betrayal without losing myself. Ethan began to thrive again, stronger for what he had endured, and I watched with quiet pride as he learned to guard his kindness with wisdom instead of walls. The moral, as simple as the old sayings my grandmother used to whisper, rang true in the end. Never let anyone convince you that goodness is weakness, and never forget that life has a way of returning what is owed, threefold, to those who mistake gentleness for surrender. Justice had been served, dignity restored, and in that balance I found a peace that no one could take away. If you've listened this far, it means the story touched you in some way, and that truly means the world to me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced someone who mistook your kindness for weakness? Share it in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories inspire me to keep going. And if you felt the same fire I did while telling this, please give it a like and hit subscribe. It's such a small gesture, but it helps me keep creating these stories and reminds me that I'm not alone in this journey. Thank you for being here with me.